Okay, so today we're going to talk about open source. Open source is defined on opensource.com as software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. It's been a long journey to get to this definition. So when computing kind of started in the 50s, it was done mostly in academia, and pretty much every app was open source. If you wanted to distribute an app, you had to distribute the source code, because we didn't have really standardized hardware, and people had to modify the app in order to get it to run. This changed in 1974, when it became possible to copyright source code. And this kind of led to the rise of a lot of the closed source companies that we know and love today. The next big milestone was the free software movement. This is Richard Stallman from MIT, and it kind of had its root in hacker culture, and they wanted to basically build an open source operating system. That was supposed to be GNU, it was supposed to be a lot like Unix. It didn't quite work, but it inspired the creation of Linux by Linus Torvalds. The creation of Linux inspired this book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and this was a very influential book detailing the process of creating Linux and a lot of learnings that came from that, and it inspired the creators of Netscape to open source Netscape. Now, still at the time, people were talking about the free software movement, and they realized that the name was very confusing. People didn't really understand what free meant, and there's like a famous quote that they say that it was free as in freedom, not as in free beer. But there was generally quite a lot of confusion. So there was a symposium, and they decided to come up with the name open source, and the Open Source Initiative was founded. Fast forward to today, when we write iOS apps in Swift, and the mobile development landscape is full of open source projects. The language that we use is open source, our dependency managers are open source, any web view is, Swift on the server, the way we process data, pretty much everything that we touch, or a lot of the sort of foundational elements of the work that we do, is based on open source. Open source also forms the foundation of modern technology in general. If you think about servers, it's like more than half of the world's servers run on Linux. If you think about mobile phones, Android has an open source core. Open source really helps drive the technology world as we experience it today. My journey with open source started about 3 years ago, and I got really into it and created a bunch of frameworks, both privately and for Spotify, the Spotify login. And they became quite popular, people used them, and it's been a very exciting journey for me. And I get to speak to a lot of people about open source. And when you speak to people about open source, to other developers, a lot of people seem very interested, and they use open source, and they want to kind of get involved, but very few people actually do open source. And this is why I wanted to have this talk. And today we're going to try and change that. And the way it's going to happen is I will give you a lot of good reasons to get more involved with open source. We'll talk a bit about sort of identifying what you should open source, and then how to do open source well. So, and we'll do all of this with a lens of Swift and iOS development. So, some good reasons why you should do open source. There's a bunch of quality reasons. So when you choose to open source a piece of software, a lot of people will have their eyes on it and will get involved. And in The Cathedral and the Bazaar, there's a quote that became known as Linus's Law, that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. This means that with a large code base with a lot of developers and like an open code base that everyone can see, it's much easier to find bugs and write better quality software. And we see this time and time again when open source often has better quality than closed source. When you write open source frameworks, you need to make things modular. You need to really follow solid principles and really contain your solution. It also forces you to really think about a generalized solution, and one that's completely decoupled from your app or wherever you initially integrated it. Also, open source allows you to solve problems that you can't solve on your own. It's problems that require collaboration. For example, when Google, they built Bazel, that's their internal build system, it was used widely inside Google. But when they open sourced it, they suddenly saw all sorts of build issues that they were able to solve and build a much more robust tool together with the community. There are a lot of personal reasons why you would like to get involved in open source as well. Open source is a great tool to grow your skills as a developer. By writing code that is modular and follows best practices and that you share widely, and by getting pull requests from people who might be more experienced than you, open source provides a really great learning opportunity. Also, there's this whole sort of like ego thing of having a reputation and getting GitHub stars and getting people using your framework, and that is quite exciting as well from a personal perspective. Lastly, there's this thing that I haven't seen many people talk about, but looking at open source frameworks that I use, a lot of them started their lives as projects, internal projects in companies, where the people who maintained them were about to leave the company, and they wanted to continue working and continue evolving these frameworks. And if you're in that situation, that's also quite a good reason to open source your project. There are a lot of business reasons to open source as well. As I said, open source is the foundation of a lot of technologies and a lot of the app companies that we work for, and it makes sense to give back to this shared repository of knowledge as well. Also, it's a great way for a company to showcase its engineering skills and the sort of quality of problem solving that it can do. And in theory, that will reflect on the company's hiring, and more people will want to work for, more developers will want to work for a company that does exciting open source. So there are many, many good reasons, and I hope at least one of these resonated with you. So what should you open source? First of all, I wanted to talk about a few myths that people have about open source projects and why and what is possible to open source. So first of all, there's this myth that it needs to be something completely new and novel, that you need to revolutionize the industry with your open source project. And I really don't think that's the case. So like with PhoneNumberKit, which I mentioned, PhoneNumberKit is essentially a port of libPhoneNumber, which is a framework that Google has built. It's available in Java and JavaScript. PhoneNumberKit itself doesn't do anything new. It just does the same stuff in Swift. And yet the community found it very valuable to have that kind of project. There's another myth that your solution needs to be some kind of a genius solution or something very, very smart to show people how great you are. And I think that's also not the case. So one of my earliest open source frameworks is called Localized Swift. And all Localized Swift is just a nicer syntax for NS-localized string in Swift. There's nothing genius about it. It's a few lines of code. And yet a lot of people found it much, much easier to interact with localization in this way. Another thing is people think that the project must be useful, or useful in an obvious way. And I also don't think that's the case. One of my projects, TV Button, was basically just recreating the 3D parallax buttons from tvOS. For iOS, I don't know anyone who would like to use that. I don't want to use it either. But just building it was an interesting exercise, and I think people wanted to see how it was implemented. So going back to the Cathedral and the Bazaar, there's a great quote there that every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's itch. So if you have an itch, if you have something that you're passionate about, that you want to solve with open source, that's a great place to start. But what if you don't have an obvious itch? And I think a lot of people are in that situation. There are actually a lot of things that you already have that are open sourceable. There are utilities that you've written that you use to make your work more productive. If you work as a consultant, I'm sure you've noticed there's work that you need to do for multiple clients, and you need to do it again and again and again. Work that doesn't exist in the open source community that you can make available. If you work in a big company, surely you have internal frameworks that don't include any secrets of how the company works that you can make available. If you don't, again, like just porting a solution from another language or another operating system is also very useful. And otherwise, you can just set yourself a personal challenge. Try and use a C library from Swift. Try and do something that you think is complicated that you will learn from. And I really hope that at least one of these resonates with you, and that is something that you think, oh, I do have that. This is something that I can share. So we had good reasons to do it. Hopefully you have like something that you think could be potentially open source. But how do you do it well? So first of all, what do we mean by well? What's success of an open source project? A successful open source project, from my perspective, is a project that has users, that people use it in their app, and that has developers who help contribute to it. Ideally, the users and the developers are the same people. So I came up with this list of 10 simple steps to isolate and review, document, name, version, legalize, readme, distribution, example, add miscellaneous, and launch. And this is basically all you need to do. And in order to memorize it, I have a nice acronym. So we're not going to touch on all of these. I just want to give you like the general gist of what needs to be done. And usually, this kind of work that goes around your open source project could last a couple of days. But it really depends on like what's your starting point. So the first question that you need to answer when you want to open source something is if you want to do it with a company, you need to figure out whether or not you can. So for us at Spotify, when I was working on Spotify login, there is a process for open sourcing stuff. You need to make sure that it doesn't include anything secret, so we're not going to open source Discover Weekly. You need to get manager approval, which is bureaucracy, copyright in header files, that needs to happen. Software review is quite interesting. So anything that we open source, we have a pool of engineers who volunteered to review software. And they go through your code and really try and see that all of the APIs make sense, that things are done in the kind of syntax that we want, and that the code works as expected. And then we have a legal approval. Speaking of legal, you will need to choose a license for your open source project. There are many, many, many licenses, too many licenses. But the three most popular ones are MIT, Apache, and GPL. MIT is a very permissive license. It basically means do whatever you want with my open source software, just put some credits there. Apache is very similar in terms of the permissiveness, but it's a bit longer and much more formal and includes some stuff about patents and not being sued. So a lot of companies prefer Apache. And GPL is sort of on the other side of the spectrum, and it means that if you want to use a GPL open source framework, you must be open source, or your project must be open source as well. Right. So when you want to open source, and again, you want to sort of tackle these 10 things, a key idea and something that you must keep in mind is that your project is essentially a product, and you're trying to launch a product. And you're trying to launch this product to developers. So if we do sort of this marketing exercise, you need to really think about what developers care about. So developers want to have their lives made easier, and I think you all relate to this. We want to take hard tasks and just make them easy. We also want something that's quality, and that has quality, and that has high code coverage. We don't want to just include a framework in our project that will be buggy and that will crash and that will make for a worse experience. We want something that's simple, that's easy to maintain. I think a big problem with open source is that sometimes it gets abandoned. And if it's a very complex project, then when you choose to integrate it, you also choose to eventually have to maintain it at some point. We're also looking for community and social proof. It really helps a project if we know that there are a lot of people behind it, a lot of people who use it, or a big company that's behind it. And all of these sort of features are encapsulated quite nicely in CocoaPod's quality metrics, which you can get on CocoaDocs. So you're thinking about all of these things, but the place where a developer will come and try and evaluate these for your project is the README file. And what I've noticed is that a lot of great projects, the README files follow a kind of similar structure. So I'm going to make this example with Fastlane, which I think is great. So the README for Fastlane starts by telling you what Fastlane is. Then it follows up by telling you what you can do with it, by giving you this very short tutorial and code example showing how easy it is to work with Fastlane. Then it tells you it gives you like a list of features, and they've done it with nice emojis here, so it's easy to read, and you just very easily understand what makes Fastlane great. You learn how to set it up and how to get started, and you get a bunch of links about how to dig deeper. It's very important to be professional with your README, and it's important to have a good name for your friend. Like, try and think of a name that's clear, that's sort of aligned with the language and the operating system that we're working in, and that doesn't clash with another name. Try and have a logo. A logo is a very small effort thing that you can do to make your project seem much more professional. If your project has some UI or has some implications for UI, having a GIF showing that UI in action is also extremely useful. And then you also need an example app. Now, example apps, again, like keeping the developers in mind, you want something to show something that's usually hard that is made easy with your project. It's also, if you're doing this for a company, it's a great place to show off like what your company does and show people how to do something similar with the framework that you just open sourced. And I also use example apps as a very easy way to test that all of the installations and the different ways to install the app work on the CI. This is an example from Async DisplayKit, which is a project from Facebook. And in their example app, they just show how to recreate the Instagram feed. And it's a great project because it shows you how easy it is to do with Async DisplayKit and get the great performance that you will use this framework for. But also gives you that insight into the people who developed it and the fact that it was developed for Instagram and for Facebook. So a couple of things that I wanted to cover from the long list of things you need to do. The D in that long acronym stands for documentation. When you go through the code that you want to open source, it's very important to document all of the public methods. Jazzy is a great tool to generate HTML from your inline documentation. And there you can see the coverage of your public methods and how many of them are covered by documentation. And really try and strive for 100%, because that's very, very useful for people who will try to use your project. Another thing is to do this kind of like a software review, but to do this software review for yourself, to review your APIs, and see that they make sense, that they're comprehensible, see that they're generalized enough, that they're not super coupled to the context with which you made the framework in the first place. Another thing I wanted to mention is the V. The V was for versioning. Versioning is extremely important. Generally, we don't do much versioning when we're working on apps, but when working on frameworks, for the people integrating your framework, it's very important to have guarantees about what will happen when they update. And also for you as a maintainer, it's very important to always have a version that people can install. A common way of doing versioning is semantic versioning. Semantic versioning basically has 3 buckets. There's a major bucket, a minor bucket, and a patch bucket. And you bump a major number when you do an incompatible API change. So then for your users, if they want to update a major number, they know that this is a big decision and might require changes on their part. A minor change is a change with new backwards compatible functionality. And a patch is simply backwards compatible bug fixes. Now you'll notice that not all changes that you do fall into these definitions, and there are a lot of edge cases. And online you can find guides that will help you decide whether or not your change, what kind of bumping you need to do for that. When you choose to use versioning, I recommend using Apple's generic versioning tool. You can set it up in Xcode and the build settings, and then you simply bump the new versions in the command line with AGV tool. You've done all of this. You're ready to launch. Don't soft launch your project. Soft launches don't really work. If something is just available, people will not magically discover it. You need to build excitement and share and make the whole thing an event. So try and get your colleagues in your local community excited about your project. Maybe speak in your local Cocoa Heads about it. Write a short Medium post. Medium is really great for writing these sort of short articles about your motivation behind the open source project and giving an example of how to use it. And that's something that's very easy to share on many forms of media. Reddit, R-Swift in particular, and iOS, and Hacker News are great places to try and publicize your framework. We have a lot of newsletters in the community, like iOS Dev Weekly or iOS Goodies, and etc. And you can submit your framework to them, and if they like it, they will feature it and get a lot of people interested in it. Also, we have these aggregators like Awesome iOS and Awesome Swift. These are repositories that are just like massive markdown files, and you can submit your framework as a change to them and get it listed on these great lists. And generally, just try and think about all sort of the media channels that you might have. So, great, we have an open source framework, we launched it, what happens next? Good things happen. You get popular, people use your stuff, you feel good, your framework is trending on GitHub, you get invited to great conferences, and you get these amazing pull requests that like completely change the way you were thinking about your project in the first place. And life is amazing. And the end. Actually, sorry, there's one more thing. This trending thing doesn't really last very long. Most trending frameworks kind of stop trending after a week or two. The stars that you were super excited about, they don't really correspond to usage. It's just people bookmarking your project to check it out later. And if you kind of had to graph the interest over time, it really does this sort of asymptotic curve of just wanes. And your excitement for your project kind of wanes with it as well. It's very important. I think like the biggest mistake that you can make is to not use that sort of initial momentum to build a community around your project. And I think that's a mistake that I've made several times with my frameworks. Ash Farrow wrote a blog post about his experience open sourcing Moya. And basically, whenever someone made a pull request to Moya, Ash gave them write access to the project as a way to make them feel like they own it and make them feel like valued contributors. And this strategy really, really works. And I've been trying it more and more with my open source framework. And it's great to really feel like there's a community behind it and that you have help in dealing with all of the PRs and issues that come. And it's really about dealing with this stream of PRs and issues. When you first open sourced your framework, you had these like amazing PRs that were super inspiring. But over time, you will get issues that are just asking you about why is your framework not solving that random use case that you didn't really think about. And people will be less inclined to provide solutions and more just ask weird questions. And if you don't have support, it's really hard to deal with all of that yourself. It's very, very easy to just get burned out and lose excitement and sort of for your framework to be abandoned. So building community is really essential if you want to have an open source framework that lasts longer and that is sustained. And everything is better with friends, so try and get more and more people involved. To wrap things up, open source is really exciting. It's an amazing journey if you choose to go on it. There are really great reasons for you to get involved. It's very easy to find something valuable to open source, and you can launch a successful project. And I hope you can learn from my mistakes and really try and build a community early. And now all you need to do is just go and write something awesome. And that's it. Thanks.